you had Deb and Tammy, and I mentioned about the fire. One of the reasons why we do the time to allow you to go to prayer, because we all have different prayer requests. We all have different praises. Actually, if I want to share a praise, my niece just had a baby on Friday. Now, here's the interesting thing. At 12:37 a.m., she told her husband she needed to go to the hospital. The baby was born a minute after 1. So 24 minutes from the time she told her husband she needed to go to the hospital to the time the baby... So my nephew sent me that, and I was like, I'm assuming they live very close to the hospital, because that didn't give them a whole lot of... Now, granted, she's a nurse and her husband's a doctor, and they probably do live close to the hospital, but... So we all... That's one of the reasons why we do this time of silence. There's no way we can go around and get everyone's prayer requests, and we all have different things. So that's why I do that, so you can... Whatever praises, whatever prayers, it's that time between you and the Lord. Now, do you know people who make things more complicated than they need to be? Now, I am going to share a little story, a couple little stories on this, just to put it in perspective. When I first got here, I think it was my first day or my second day, as I'm getting into the office, Margaret handed me a binder. And I looked at this thick binder, and I said, "What's that?" She goes, "It's the church constitution and regulations and policies." I looked at it, I said, "I'm not going to read that." I said, "I can tell right now it's way too complicated." And there was the Constitution, I'm going to look at Becky, 5 to 6 pages was the Constitution. The standard Constitution for the Eastern Region Conference is about a page and a half. So I was trying to figure out what did they add to make this Constitution so long. And then the procedure book was 120 and 130 pages long of procedures and rules and regulations of operating the church. And I was like, this is ridiculous. So, and I kept saying it's too complicated, this is too complicated. And mind you, this is really without me reading it in detail. I just know 120, 130 pages of documents to run a church was overblown. So then we decided that we were going to look and trim the stuff down. I said, "Oh, do you want me to go through it?" I said, "All I need is a red marker." And I just went through pages and just crossed out pages, crossed out blocks of pages, crossed out all kinds of different things. And everything I crossed out told you things you weren't supposed to do. Okay? Pages of things you weren't supposed to do. I said, that's not how policy should work. So to put it in another perspective, have any of you ever tasted somebody's food and you're like, "I really like the recipe," and you asked them for the recipe? When they gave you the recipe, did it list all the items you shouldn't put in there? Or did the recipe say, these are the items you need, and this is the process in which to make it? Right? When we make peanut butter, our peanut butter egg recipe does not say, do not put pineapples in it. It does not say, do not add avocados. It says, this is what you do. Well, we had a policy manual, a bunch of things not to do. I said, if you just write what you're supposed to do, anything that's not that is wrong. And we started working through this, so they are two examples how something could be made more complicated than it need to be, right? If we told you what not to do with making eggs, hey, you don't beat them with a rolling pin or whatever. You don't have to put that in if that's not what you're going to use. So ways things can be made complicated by adding a lot of stuff that's not necessary. Now, for the ERC, right now it's the Church Health Commission, I stepped off of that about a year and a half ago, but before it became Church Health, it was the Evangelism Commission. And I was on the Evangelism Commission for about 6-7 years, and I was the chair of the commission for the last 3 years before it got merged and became the Church Health. And as I taught evangelism classes, I taught them for churches, I taught them at seminars. We even started the Evangelism Summit, where we would have kind of little briefer sessions to give people a taste of what this course was about and if they wanted the course brought to their church. So I taught a lot of classes, and I was amazed at how complicated people can make things. A lot of complications when it comes to something like that is how it comes from people not being confident in their ability to do something. So they think of all the possible things that could go wrong. Now, so let me tell you something. If you spent your time thinking about all the ways something could go wrong, you would never leave your house again. Because a lot of things can go wrong when you leave. A lot of things can go wrong in your house. So, and I'm not here saying I'm an optimist. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm not an optimist, and I don't always think everything will work out, but I like to think of myself as a realist, where I'm trying to look at things and at all the different possible incomes or outcomes of an event. I like to think of the good and the bad. And if the bad drastically outweigh the good, then I'm probably going to pass on doing that. But more often or not, it's rarely that drastic of a difference between the good and the bad. So when we're talking about evangelism or sharing Jesus with someone, the worst case scenario is that person says they're not interested. If that's the worst case scenario, if that's a deal breaker for taking a chance on something, men will never ask women out ever again. There will be no more proms, no more homecoming dances, or anything else because someone might say they're not interested. So we just stop doing all that. All right, that might be a little over dramatic. But as far as sharing about Jesus, it's not complicated. We just need a little confidence. So today I thought I would give us a little insight from someone who was very good at it. Paul. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. Now this passage is Paul arriving in Thessalonica. And Thessalonica, boy, sometimes I can just get stuck. Thessalonica was one of the wealthiest and most influential cities in Macedonia. This is the first city that Paul visited where his teachings attracted a large group of socially prominent citizens. And as was Paul's custom, Paul planted a church. He planted a church there. It grew very rapidly. And this was before Paul was forced out by the angry mob that we read about at the end of the passage today. Now the first part talks about how some Jews were persuaded that Jesus was the Messiah. Along with those Jews, a large number of God-fearing Greeks and many prominent women. So what was this amazing thing that Paul did? That he was able to plant a church and get so many to come to know Jesus. And that always seems to be the million-dollar question, isn't it? When it comes to sharing Jesus with someone. What is that magic antidote, those magic words? So Paul arrives, and he immediately goes to the Jewish synagogue. Paul went into the synagogue on 3 Sabbath days, so you can guess that he was there at least 3 weeks. during this time. And then at the synagogue, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, as was his custom. Now, we would say, from an evangelist viewpoint, he met them where they were at. And that would be the synagogue. And he used the scripture, which would be our Old Testament, to talk to them about the Messiah. But the scripture is what the Jews would know in the synagogue. It's what they've been taught. It's what they understand. So he spoke with the Jews where they were as far as their knowledge of God and the Messiah. So he basically went and started teaching them from a place they are familiar. Paul then used that information that they were comfortable with, the scriptures, and revealed how the scriptures pointed out that Jesus was the Messiah. Now remember, the Jews have been waiting for the Messiah. They know where to look for the clues. What he did is said, these are the clues you're looking for. And guess what? Jesus meets all these requirements. He pointed out that the Christ had to suffer, and Jesus suffered. That the Messiah, the Christ, was going to rise from the dead, and that he pointed out that's exactly what Jesus did. So some Jews believed, some Gentiles believed, and the church was planted. Now, I included verses 5 through 9 so we could see that some of the Jews were jealous. They rallied up a mob, they started a riot, and made false accusations against Paul and what he was teaching. But one of the things, as you read this, and those of you who did the teaser video, I want to know if you actually picked up on this. Notice that the Jews that started the riot or started the mob or they did not argue any of the facts of what Paul was teaching about the scriptures, about the Christ, about the Messiah, about Jesus. They did not argue any of that information. Paul's teaching was sound, it was accurate, and the Jews got jealous, and they couldn't stand the fact that people were starting to follow Paul and his church and turning away from the synagogue's teaching. They had more of a problem that they were listening to Paul and turning away. And they also had a problem that he was teaching something that was against what Caesar and Rome wanted. Now, we have to remember, a lot of the religious leaders were very tied into Rome. They got a lot of benefits and perks as the Pharisees and Sadducees. So they were getting upset with that too, because they were saying he proclaimed another king, and that would be against everything, and that would actually bring the Roman guard down too. So I include those verses because we need to understand that when we are sharing with Jesus with people, that some people are going to get jealous, some people are going to get angry, and some people are going to try to cause trouble. That's just the way it is. That's pretty much with anything in nowadays. If they don't agree with you, what we call it cancel culture. They just try to turn everything against you, and there is no, let's just have a difference of opinion anymore. It's either you have my opinion or we try to shut you down. And that's kind of what's trying to happen here, as they're trying to shut down Paul and Silas and what they're teaching. And Satan doesn't want anyone to win people to Jesus, so he will use bad characters to stir up a crowd, to make false accusations against, as we see against Paul and Silas, but also against us. So my question is that a deal breaker for you? Knowing that someone may make false accusations against you or stir up a mob, because it definitely wasn't a deal breaker for Paul. You can go through all the different things that Paul went through to preach the gospel and share the gospel. So what is this magic approach that Paul used to win people to Jesus? He went to people where they were. And in this case, it was the synagogue. He spoke to them from where they were at. And spiritually, in this case, that's the Old Testament scriptures, because that's what they were raised up on. In today's world, you really need to figure out where people are. When we're talking to people, we need to know where they are in their relationship and their understanding. We need to have conversations with people to see what their understanding is. That's why we use that personal journey pamphlet, to help people to look in there and determine where they are. Once we know where they are, we know where we can start the conversation. Because it's not enough in our world today to ask someone if they believe in God. Because in our world, the first thing you need to do is figure out what their definition of God is. Because there's all kinds of definitions of what God might be. There's a lot of different things that people worship. And despite what you might hear on some TV talk shows, all gods are not the same. And all religions don't basically believe the same thing. So you really need to understand what someone believes before you can have that conversation. You see, Paul spent 3 weeks, 3 different Sabbaths in the synagogue. And he already knew what their basic beliefs were because they were in a synagogue. You can't just go to a different church and